Today, I want to take you inside a surprising and controversial conversation about a medication that has changed millions of lives, Ozempic, and what emerging science is beginning to reveal about its complex relationship with the liver and metabolism. We are going to explore both the promising benefits and the potential risks that researchers are still working to fully understand. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the important health insights I share with you every week. When most people hear about GLP-1 medications like Ozempic, they immediately think of weight loss, blood sugar control, and dramatic metabolic improvements. But as a physician and scientist, I always look deeper than the surface story. Recent research coming out of major academic centers has suggested something fascinating and unexpected. These drugs may not only work through weight reduction, but may also have direct biological effects on organs like the liver itself. That idea, EA, is both exciting and unsettling because it challenges what many of us thought we understood about how these treatments work. In some clinical studies, patients with fatty liver disease and inflammation showed significant improvement after extended treatment, with reductions in liver inflammation and even signs of decreased scarring. In controlled environments, where patients were carefully monitored and gradually introduced to the medication, these results suggested that GLP-1 drugs might play a role in improving liver health beyond just helping people lose weight. At the same time, I want you to understand something very important. Science is rarely one-sided, and every powerful therapy carries complexity. Alongside these promising findings, there have also been clinical observations and case reports where individuals experience sharp and concerning changes in liver enzymes shortly after starting treatment. In some rare but serious situations, patients developed signs of acute life versus stress that required emergency medical attention. These opposing outcomes raise an important scientific question. How can the same medication appear to support liver healing in one context while potentially contributing to liver strain in another? This is where things become truly interesting from a medical perspective, because it suggests that the effect of GLP-1 drugs may depend heavily on dosage, patient condition, metabolic state, and how the body is responding at a cellular level. What we are likely seeing is not a simple good or bad effect, but rather a dual-phase response that is still being mapped out by researchers around the world. In carefully designed trials involving patients with metabolic liver disease, many participants experienced measurable improvements in inflammation and liver fat over time, especially when treatment was closely supervised and gradually adjusted. Some studies even showed improvements in liver fibrosis markers, which points toward potential repair of damaged tissue under certain conditions. But these results came from highly controlled environments with strict monitoring, medical screening, and specific patient selection criteria. Outside of those controlled settings, real-world use can look very different, and that is where caution becomes essential. We also now understand that GLP-1 receptors are not limited to the pancreas or brain as once believed, but may also be present in tissues like the liver, suggesting a more direct biological interaction than previously thought. This discovery helps explain why some patients experience metabolic improvements that seem disproportionate to weight loss alone, but it also opens the door to questions about unintended effects when that signaling pathway is strongly activated over time. In my view, this is one of the most important evolving areas in metabolic medicine today, because we are no longer just talking about weight loss drugs. We are talking about medications that may actively reshape organ function in ways we are still learning to predict. And while these breakthroughs are promising, they also remind us that the human body is not a simple system. And when we intervene at a hormonal level, we must always consider both intended and unintended consequences. Today, I want to break down one of the most important clinical trials that changed how we think about Ozempic and liver disease, and I also want to show you why the results are far more complex than most headlines suggest. We are going to look at how a diabetes and weight loss drug ended up being studied as a potential treatment for fatty liver disease, and why that created both excitement and confusion in the medical world. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you can stay updated on the latest science that affects your health. Let me walk you through a landmark study published in one of the most respected medical journals in the world, where researchers followed hundreds of patients. And ants with fatty liver disease linked to metabolic dysfunction. These were individuals with real liver inflammation, confirmed through biopsies, meaning doctors were not guessing, they were directly looking at liver tissue under the microscope before and after treatment. In this study, patients were given Ozempic over a long period of time and compared against a placebo group, which is essentially an inactive treatment used to measure true drug effects. What the researchers found was striking. A significantly higher percentage of patients on the medication showed complete resolution of liver inflammation compared to those who received placebo. Even more interesting, there was measurable improvement in liver scarring, known as fibrosis, in a meaningful portion of treated patients. Now, as a physician, I always want you to notice something important. Here, the placebo group also improved, which tells us the body has a natural ability to heal when metabolism is optimized, diet is controlled, and patients are closely monitored. But the drug group still performed better, which suggests there is a real biological effect beyond just lifestyle changes or expectation bias. Over time, these findings became strong enough that regulatory authorities began to seriously consider GLP-1 medications, not just for diabetes or weight loss, but for advanced metabolic liver disease as well. In fact, in 2025, regulatory approval was granted for use in a specific subset of patients with biopsy-confirmed stages of fatty liver disease with inflammation and scarring. But here is where the story becomes much more nuanced, because these outcomes did not happen in isolation or in uncontrolled environments. These patients were carefully selected, closely monitored, and gradually titrated onto medication doses in a structured medical setting. That matters a lot because it is very different from how many people actually receive these medications in everyday clinical practice today. For years, scientists and STs assumed that the improvements in liver health were simply a downstream effect of weight loss. The logic was straightforward: lose fat, reduce inflammation, improve liver function. But then something unexpected happened. Researchers began noticing that some patients showed improvements in liver enzymes and tissue markers that seemed too significant to be explained by weight loss alone. This is where a deeper layer of biology started to emerge. A key figure in this research field, Daniel Drucker, one of the original scientists involved in discovering GLP-1 biology, questioned whether we were missing something fundamental. His team explored whether GLP-1 signaling might be acting directly on liver tissue rather than only through changes in body weight. In experimental models, they designed studies where animals were prevented from losing weight entirely, yet were still given GLP-1 based drugs. The result was surprising. Even without weight loss, markers of liver inflammation and fibrosis and cysts still improved. That finding challenged the long-held assumption that all benefits were secondary to fat reduction. It suggested that GLP-1 receptors may exist in places we did not fully appreciate before, including within liver-related metabolic pathways. Now, what does this mean for patients in the real world? It means we are dealing with a medication that may have multiple layers of action, some dependent on weight loss, and others potentially independent of it. And that complexity is exactly why outcomes can vary so widely between individuals. In carefully controlled trials with strict inclusion criteria, the benefits appear more consistent and measurable. But in general population use, where patients have different metabolic health profiles, varying degrees of liver disease, and different dosing patterns, the response becomes much less predictable. One of the most important things to understand is that not every patient experiences the same liver benefit, and estimates suggest. Only a subset of individuals with specific metabolic profiles show the strongest improvements. At the same time, many people using these medications are not being routinely screened or monitored for liver enzyme changes in a structured way, especially outside specialized care settings. That gap between controlled research and real-world usage is where both the promise and the risk of this medication really sit. And it is exactly why we need to look at both sides of the evidence with equal seriousness, rather than focusing only on dramatic success stories or isolated adverse reports. What I want to do next is bring your attention to the part of this story that most people never hear about, and that is what happens outside of controlled clinical trials in real-world patients when the medication is used for weight loss rather than for carefully monitored liver disease treatment. Because while we have talked about the potential benefits in metabolic liver conditions, we also need to take an LK about the other side of the equation, where things can become unpredictable, especially when the body is already under metabolic stress. In everyday clinical practice, patients are often started on GLP-1 medications with a standard dosing plan, not a slow, individualized titration under intensive monitoring, and that difference alone can significantly change how the body responds. I want to share a clinical pattern that doctors have reported where some individuals experience sudden changes in liver enzymes shortly after starting therapy, sometimes within days or weeks, which raises concern for acute liver stress in rare cases. Now, I want to be very clear with you. This does not mean the medication is unsafe for everyone, but it does mean that the liver is an organ we need to pay attention to more carefully than we often do in routine prescribing. There was even a reported case scenario involving a patient who developed extremely elevated liver enzyme levels shortly after initiation. And G therapy, levels that in other medical contexts would be associated with serious liver injury, and that kind of observation forces us as clinicians to ask deeper questions about susceptibility, genetics, dosing, and underlying metabolic health. At the same time, another major system that is directly affected by GLP-1 medications is the gallbladder, and this is something most people never think about when they start treatment. Your gallbladder is responsible for storing and releasing bile to help process dietary fat, and when appetite is significantly reduced and fat intake changes rapidly, bile flow dynamics can shift in ways that may promote stagnation. Over time, this can contribute to bile thickening, sludge formation, and in some cases, gallstone development, especially in individuals who are losing weight quickly. This is one reason why regulatory agencies have updated safety labeling to include warnings about gallbladder-related events, because this is not just a theoretical risk. And it has been observed in real populations. Now, step back for a moment and connect the dots with me, because what we are really talking about is a system-wide metabolic shift. When you take a GLP-1 medication, you are not just changing appetite. You are altering signaling pathways that affect the brain, the gut, the pancreas, the liver, and even how fat is mobilized and processed. One of the key effects is that people eat significantly less, which leads to rapid changes in energy balance. In the short term, this can be beneficial for reducing liver fat, but in some individuals, it also means a sudden influx of fatty acids being mobilized from adipose tissue and processed through the liver, which can temporarily increase metabolic load before improvement occurs. In a healthy liver, this transition can be handled efficiently, but in a liver that is already insulin resistant or inflamed, that sudden shift may create stress rather than relief, at least in the early phase. And this is where we need to talk about something even more fundamental, which is the difference between natural GLP-1 signaling and pharmaceutical GLP-1 stimulation. In your body, GLP-1 is released naturally from the gut in response to eating, and it acts for a very short period of time, on the order of minutes, helping regulate appetite and glucose in a tightly controlled rhythm. But with medications like Semaglutide, you are extending that signal for days at a time, creating a sustained hormonal environment that the body was never naturally designed to experience continuously. That does not automatically make it harmful, but it does mean the system is being pushed into a non-physiological state. And anytime we do that in medicine, we have to expect adaptation, compensation, and sometimes unintended effects. Now, let's talk about what happens when people stop the medication, because this is another part of the story that often gets overlooked. In follow-up observations from clinical practice, many individuals regain a significant portion of the weight they lost after discontinuation. And along with that, metabolic markers such as blood sugar control and cardiovascular risk indicators often drift back toward baseline. Even more importantly, studies analyzing body composition have shown that a substantial portion of weight loss on these medications can come not only from fat, but also from lean mass, including muscle and bone, particularly when protein intake and resistance training are not prioritized. This matters because muscle is not just cosmetic tissue, it is metabolically active tissue that helps regulate glucose and overall energy balance. So when we lose muscle, we can actually make underlying insulin resistance worse over time, even if body weight initially improves. And this brings us to the core issue underneath almost all cases of obesity and metabolic dysfunction, which is insulin resistance. When insulin signaling becomes impaired, the body becomes locked into a high. And our weight set point, making fat loss more difficult and fat storage more likely, regardless of willpower alone. GLP-1 medications help bypass some of that signaling dysfunction, which is why they are so effective, but they do not necessarily repair the underlying metabolic environment that caused the problem in the first place. That is why I always emphasize that long-term success, whether someone is on these medications or not, depends heavily on rebuilding metabolic health through lifestyle and environment. Practically speaking, that means prioritizing sufficient protein intake to preserve muscle, incorporating resistance training to maintain metabolic strength, increasing fiber from fermented and whole food sources to support gut signaling, and reducing excessive refined carbohydrates to improve insulin sensitivity. These are not just diet tips, they are foundational metabolic interventions that determine how your liver, your pancreas, and your entire energy system respond over time. And and perhaps most importantly, we have to think beyond just biology and look at environment, because your daily surroundings shape your habits more than motivation ever will. The foods available to you, the stress you are under, the sleep you get, and the cues in your environment all interact with your metabolism in powerful ways. Medications like Ozempic can be powerful tools, but they work best when they are paired with a system that supports long-term metabolic resilience rather than dependence alone. And that ultimately is the bigger picture I want you to walk away with today. Not fear, not hype, but a deeper understanding that your liver and your metabolism are part of a highly interconnected system, and any intervention we use must respect that complexity if we want truly lasting health. One more thing before you go. If you found value in this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it so more people can learn this important information. Stay with me for more IO and penning health insights, because one life means one chance to take care of your body the right way.